I never imagined a handful of wildflowers could bring a luxury country club to its knees. But then again, I never imagined anyone would be arrogant enough to bulldoze nearly an acre of my family's land while I was out of town and expect me to smile, cash a check, and pretend it never happened. Looking back now, I don't think the bees were ever getting revenge. They were simply trying to survive. And somehow that made everything that followed feel strangely poetic. My name is Ethan Walker, and for almost 15 years I lived on a quiet 16-acre property outside the little town of Ash Hollow, a place where mornings started with birdsong instead of traffic, and evenings smelled like fresh clover after summer rain. My grandmother Eleanor had bought that land long before I was born, back when the surrounding hills were all family farms and dirt roads. She used to tell me that land wasn't something you owned forever, it was something you borrowed from the next generation. Every spring she planted more native flowers than the year before, because she believed every butterfly and every honeybee deserved a place to come home. When she passed away, the only thing she asked of me was to keep the meadow alive. She didn't leave me a fortune. She left me seeds. Jars full of carefully labeled seeds she'd collected over 40 years. Native lupin, blanket flowers, coneflowers, milkweed, black-eyed Susans, dozens of varieties most people couldn't even name anymore. Every spring I'd spend weeks walking those fields with a small canvas bag over my shoulder, reseeding bare patches, pulling invasive weeds by hand, watching the place slowly wake up after winter. By June, the whole meadow looked like someone had spilled every color imaginable across the hills. Photographers stopped along the county road just to take pictures. Local teachers brought school kids out to learn about pollinators. Complete strangers would pull over and ask if they could walk the trails for an hour. I never charged anyone a cent. Seeing people smile was payment enough. The bees loved it even more than the visitors did. What started as 3 hives eventually grew into 12 healthy colonies, producing some of the finest wildflower honey in the county. Every Saturday morning I'd load coolers into my old pickup and drive down to the farmer's market in town, and by lunchtime every single jar would usually be sold out. People told me they could taste the difference, since the honey came from real native flowers instead of commercial crops. Maybe they were right. My neighbor, old Frank, used to laugh whenever he stopped by. "Those bees are working harder than half the folks I know," he'd say, stealing another biscuit off my kitchen counter. We'd sit on the porch drinking coffee, watching hummingbirds dart across the meadow, and honestly, I believed life would always stay that simple. Then Cedar Ridge Country Club expanded. When it first opened a few years earlier, I hadn't worried much. They'd built a beautiful clubhouse, 2 swimming pools, tennis courts, and enough polished landscaping to fill a magazine spread. Wealthy families moved into the neighborhoods nearby. Memberships grew expensive enough to make my old truck look like pocket change, and every holiday weekend they threw elaborate parties with live bands and catered dinners. Strangely enough, we got along just fine. Their members liked seeing my meadow past the white fence, because it made the place feel more genuine, like they'd escaped the city without giving up any of the luxury. Parents even thanked me because their kids could watch butterflies while waiting for swim practice to wrap up. I honestly thought we'd found the perfect balance. They enjoyed the view, my bees ignored them, and everyone minded their own business. Then a new board president took over. His name was Preston Hale, a commercial developer from the city who smiled like every conversation was already a business deal. The first time we met, he looked out across my fields and said that was an awful lot of valuable real estate for someone who just grows flowers. I smiled politely and told him they weren't just flowers. He chuckled like I'd told a joke. That should have told me everything I needed to know. To Preston, land only had value if you could pave it, build on it, or charge people to park on it. To me, it had value because it was alive. We never argued, but every time our paths crossed, I'd catch him staring toward my meadow like he was already redrawing the property lines in his head. A month later, I drove out to Colorado to spend several days helping my older sister recover from knee surgery. Before I left, I walked through the meadow one last time as the sun came up, listening to millions of bees humming softly over the flowers, never imagining it would be the last morning I'd see it the way my grandmother had left it. 5 days later, I turned into my driveway, and before I'd even shut off the engine, something felt horribly wrong. What I found beyond the trees changed everything. I stepped out of my truck expecting to hear the familiar hum of bees drifting across the meadow. Instead, silence hit me first. It wasn't complete quiet. There were engines idled, car doors slammed, people laughed somewhere beyond the tree line, but the sound that had filled this land for years was gone. I hurried toward the western edge of my property, and with every step my stomach tightened, until I finally cleared the last row of maple trees and just stood there, frozen. Nearly an acre of my meadow had disappeared. The flowers were gone. The topsoil my grandmother had spent decades nurturing had been scraped away like it meant nothing. Fresh black asphalt stretched across the land. Bright white parking lines shimmered under the afternoon sun, and luxury SUVs already sat in spaces that, according to every survey ever recorded, belonged to me. The smell of fresh pavement overpowered what should have been the scent of wildflowers. I remember kneeling beside the edge of the asphalt and finding a crushed patch of purple lupin sticking out from under the gravel, flattened into the dirt like it had never existed. I picked up one broken stem without even realizing I was crying. It wasn't about losing flowers. It was about someone deciding that years of care could be erased in a single weekend because it was more convenient for them. Frank came walking over from his place a few minutes later, hat in his hands, looking almost embarrassed. "Ethan, I tried calling you. They started on Monday. I told the foreman they were over the line, but he said the club had engineers and lawyers. Nobody called the county. I asked. A few people did. They said it was a civil property dispute." I nodded slowly, because I already knew what that meant. Nobody wanted to stop wealthy people in the middle of construction. They'd rather let the courts sort it out later. I drove straight to Cedar Ridge Country Club, still covered in road dust, and walked into their polished lobby, where everything smelled like expensive candles and polished wood. Behind the front desk, a young receptionist smiled, until she saw my face. "Is Mr. Hale available?" I asked. "Do you have an appointment?" "He'll want to make time." A few minutes later Preston appeared, wearing golf clothes that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, smiling the way people smile when they think they've already won. "Ethan, welcome back. I hear you noticed the improvements. You paved my property." "Now hold on," he said, raising both hands dramatically. "Our survey indicates the new parking expansion falls entirely within club boundaries." I pulled a rolled survey map from the truck, spread it across a conference table without asking permission, and pointed straight at the recorded property markers. "Your survey is wrong." He barely glanced at it. "Survey companies disagree all the time. Not with county monuments, they don't." He leaned back in his chair and sighed like I was wasting his afternoon. "Look, we've already invested close to $800,000 into this expansion. Litigation won't help either of us. Why don't we simply purchase the disputed strip from you?" "Disputed?" I stared at him. "There's nothing disputed about it." He smiled again. "Everything is negotiable." I folded my survey slowly. "No, it isn't." His smile faded a little. "Everybody has a price. Not for something my grandmother trusted me to protect." For the first time, he looked genuinely confused. He couldn't understand why anyone would turn down what he considered easy money. That's when it hit me. We weren't even speaking the same language. I was talking about legacy. He was talking about assets. Before I left, I gave him exactly 30 days to remove every inch of asphalt from my property, restore the soil, and cover the cost of the environmental damage. He laughed. Actually laughed. "You're letting emotions get in the way of business, Ethan. Have your attorney call ours." Then he walked off before I could respond. 2 weeks passed. Nothing happened. Then something even worse did. The club put up elegant wooden signs labeling the new section Premium Garden View Parking, charging members extra to park in spaces built directly on top of my ruined meadow. Every luxury SUV sitting there felt like another insult. I hired a property attorney, Melissa Grant, who specialized in land disputes. After going through every deed, aerial photograph, county survey, and historical record, she looked up and said, "This isn't a gray area. They're clearly trespassing." "Then why aren't they worried?" I asked. She smiled slightly. "Because they've spent their entire lives believing money fixes consequences. We filed formal notices, demanded immediate restoration, requested injunctions, and documented every square foot of damage with survey crews. Preston's attorneys answered with delay after delay, hoping legal costs would eventually wear me down. They underestimated two things. First, I wasn't interested in selling. Second, I wasn't finished thinking. About a week later, I walked through what remained of my meadow carrying empty hive boxes. The surviving bees looked confused. Their feeding grounds had been cut almost in. Half of it was simply gone. Worker bees wandered farther every day, searching for nectar that no longer existed. Watching them struggle hurt more than looking at the destroyed flowers themselves. They weren't angry. They were just trying to adapt after humans had wrecked their world, and somehow they seemed to understand that. That evening, I went to the monthly County Beekeepers Association meeting. Most of the people there were retirees, hobbyists, and farmers I'd known for years. Halfway through the coffee and homemade pie, I stood up and explained what had happened. The room went quiet. Finally, an older beekeeper named Martha crossed her arms and asked, "How much open meadow do you still have?" "About 15 acres. Enough for a few more colonies?" I thought it over. "Probably." She smiled. "I've got 4 hives looking for better forage." Someone else spoke up. "I've got 6. Another voice from the back. "I've got 3. Within 10 minutes, people were volunteering colonies faster than I could keep count. Nobody was after revenge. They simply wanted safe forage for healthy bees, and I happened to have plenty of legal space to offer. Melissa laughed when I told her the plan. "You realize you're doing absolutely nothing illegal. That's kind of the point." Over the next 2 weeks, flatbed trailers rolled onto my property almost daily, carrying carefully managed honeybee colonies. We set them well inside my property line, exactly where the regulations allowed, facing away from the club and toward the remaining wildflowers. By the end of the month, 60 thriving hives sat across my fields, home to nearly 3 million honeybees. The air hummed again. It sounded like life coming back after a funeral. Frank stood beside me one evening, watching thousands of bees stream out of their hives under the setting sun. "Think they'll notice?" he asked with a grin. I watched the golden cloud drift across the meadow. Eventually, I honestly believed the club would come to see that restoring the flowers was easier than fighting nature. I underestimated just how stubborn wealthy people can get when admitting a mistake feels costlier than doubling down on another one. And Memorial Day weekend was only 3 days out. Memorial Day arrived with perfect weather, one of those bright blue mornings that pulls everyone outside. From my porch, I could already hear music drifting over from Cedar Ridge Country Club before breakfast. By noon, the parking lot was full, every one of those premium spaces sitting on top of what used to be my grandmother's meadow now, occupied by polished SUVs and luxury sedans. I wasn't watching because I wanted something bad to happen. Honestly, part of me still hoped Preston would walk across the fence that morning, shake my hand, admit he'd made a serious mistake, and tell his contractors to start tearing up the asphalt the following week. Instead, I watched catering staff carry trays of pastries, fresh fruit, soft drinks, frozen desserts, and cocktails out onto the pool deck while thousands of worker bees left my hives searching for food. They did exactly what bees have always done. They followed the scent. Their flowers were gone, so they adapted. At first, only a few landed near the dessert tables. Then a few dozen. Then hundreds. I could see children pointing at them from across the fence while adults laughed and swatted them away with napkins. 10 minutes later, the laughter stopped. Someone dropped an entire tray of watermelon. Sweet juice spread across the concrete, drawing in even more bees. Then another guest knocked over a cooler full of soda. The whole mood shifted at once. It wasn't an attack. It was a feeding frenzy caused by sugar, panic, and people who had no idea how to behave around pollinators. The first scream echoed across the pool. Another followed. Lifeguards blew their whistles. Parents grabbed their kids and ran, knocking over chairs and umbrellas. Someone jumped into the deep end fully clothed. Waiters abandoned their serving carts, leaving cakes and fruit behind to draw in still more bees. Within minutes, the elegant holiday celebration looked like the closing scene of a disaster film. Emergency vehicles showed up, Not because people were being swarmed to death, as rumors later claimed, but because frightened crowds create their own dangerous situations. Most of the stings were minor. A handful of people with allergies were treated as a precaution, and thankfully everyone recovered. The real damage wasn't medical, it was reputational. My phone rang before the last ambulance had even left the property. Preston was shouting so loudly I had to hold the phone away from my ear. "Call them off," he yelled. "Your bees are attacking my members." I waited until he finally ran out of breath. "Preston, they're honeybees. They don't have a commander. Move the hives. They're on my property. This is intentional." "No," I answered quietly. Destroying their food source was intentional. This is what happened afterward. He hung up without another word. The following weeks only made things worse for the club. Every outdoor event became a gamble. Caterers struggled to keep food covered. Parents stopped bringing their kids. Weekend attendance dropped. Professional exterminators admitted there was very little they could legally do, since spraying pesticides near swimming pools, food service areas, and neighboring agricultural hives would create even bigger liabilities. They tried giant fans, smoke machines, scented repellents, decorative traps, everything except fixing the actual problem. Local news picked up the story after several members demanded refunds. Reporters interviewed environmental experts who explained something I'd been saying all along. Pollinators establish reliable feeding patterns, and when a mature habitat is suddenly wiped out, they naturally expand their search into whatever's nearby. Then the insurance investigators showed up. Once they went through county records, survey reports, environmental assessments, and construction permits, they found something Preston had conveniently overlooked. The club had expanded onto private property while destroying an established pollinator habitat without completing several required environmental reviews. Their insurer denied coverage for much of the resulting liability, since the underlying trespass and habitat destruction had clearly raised the foreseeable risk. Suddenly Preston wasn't arguing with me anymore. He was arguing with board members, attorneys, insurers, and furious club members whose expensive summer memberships had turned into endless meetings about legal bills. About 6 weeks after Memorial Day, Melissa called and simply said, "You should come to my office." Preston was already there when I arrived. He looked older than he had 2 months earlier. The confidence was gone. The expensive smile had vanished. He slid a folder across the table without a word. Inside was a proposed settlement. I closed it without reading the numbers. "The parking lot goes first," I said. "Every inch." He nodded. "Done. The soil gets professionally restored." Another nod. "Native wildflowers, not decorative landscaping." "Agreed. You compensate me for the destroyed honey harvest, the damaged colonies, restoration costs, legal fees, and the long-term ecological losses." He rubbed his forehead before answering quietly, "We'll pay." Nobody spoke for a long moment. Finally, he looked up and asked, almost to himself, "Was all this really worth it?" I looked out the conference room window before answering. "You keep asking the wrong question. You think this was about parking spaces. It was never about parking spaces." 2 weeks later, excavators came back to my property. This time they weren't destroying something, they were undoing a mistake. The fresh asphalt disappeared truckload by truckload until sunlight touched the soil again. Restoration specialists spent months rebuilding what careless machinery had wiped out in a matter of days. Volunteers from the local beekeeping association helped reseed native flowers using seeds gathered from the surviving sections of the meadow, some of which had originally come from my grandmother's own collection. The first spring after the restoration, I walked across that field just after sunrise. Small patches of purple, yellow, and red were starting to bloom again. The bees found them almost right away. Their familiar hum drifted through the morning air, and for the first time since I'd come back from Colorado, the land sounded like home again. Cedar Ridge Country Club still operates today. They have a smaller parking lot now, and every summer their guests once again admire the meadow from a respectful distance. Sometimes I wonder whether Preston ever really understood what happened, or whether he still tells himself that losing all that money came down to bad luck instead of bad decisions. Personally, I think nature simply has a remarkable way of sending invoices no lawyer can talk down. So now I'd like to hear from you. If you came home to find someone had paved over part of your family's land, would you have handled it differently? Or do you think letting natural consequences run their course was the fairest response? Share your thoughts in the comments because I read every one of them. And if you enjoy stories about ordinary people standing their ground without crossing the line, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and